My stepson laughed when I lost my job. 3 weeks later, he learned who really paid the price. The sound of his laughter followed me from the kitchen into the garage, sharp and brittle like dry leaves underfoot. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy, and it was directed at the single worst moment of my life. I had just told Sarah and Leo that the company was downsizing, that my position as a senior project manager had been eliminated after 12 years. I had expected shock, maybe pity, or at least a respectful silence. Instead, from the boy who had called me Marcus for the last 5 years, I got a snicker that grew into a full-throated laugh. He was 17, all sharp angles and practiced indifference, and he looked at me with a gleam in his eyes that said he had been waiting for this. "So that's it?" he'd asked, leaning back in his chair, the picture of teenage arrogance. "You're just done?" Then the laugh. It wasn't a nervous reaction. It was a judgment. I closed the door to my small workspace. The smell of sawdust and oil, a familiar comfort that did nothing to soothe the acid churning in my gut. I gripped the edge of my workbench, knuckles white, and stared at the neat rows of tools hanging on the pegboard. Each one was in its place, a testament to a life built on order and reliability. For a decade, I had been the provider, the steady hand. I had married Sarah 6 years ago, a widow with a young son, and I had thrown myself into the role of husband and father. I had treated Leo as my own. I paid for his private school tuition, the expensive hockey camps, the latest gaming consoles that were always out of stock. I had never asked for anything but a modicum of respect, a simple acknowledgement that I was trying. And in return, he saw my downfall as entertainment. The laughter echoed in my head, a taunt that stripped away years of effort and left me feeling like a fool. Sarah had rushed in after me, her face a mask of apology. "Marcus, he's a kid. He doesn't understand the gravity of this. He's just being an idiot." She reached for my arm, but I pulled away, not out of anger at her, but because the space around me felt like it was shrinking. "He understood enough to laugh," I said, my voice low and rough. "He saw an opening and he took it." I looked at her, my wife, the woman I had built a life with. Has he ever once in all these years shown a single ounce of genuine appreciation for anything I've done? Sarah's silence was her answer. She loved her son, and she always made excuses for him. He was grieving his father. He was hormonal. He was struggling. But I saw something else. I saw a cold calculation that had been there for years, a deep-seated resentment that I was an interloper who had taken his father's place. He didn't want a stepfather. He wanted a target. That night, the house was heavy with a tension you could almost touch. Leo stayed in his room, the faint thud of bass from his headphones vibrating through the floorboards. Sarah tried to make a comforting dinner that I couldn't eat. I sat in the living room staring at the wall, my mind a frantic storm of what-ifs. The mortgage, the car payments, Leo's tuition for the upcoming semester, a bill that was due in a month and cost more than most people made in 3OA, had a small severance package, but it wouldn't last long. I needed a plan. I was 45 years old. My entire professional network was in an industry that was suddenly contracting. I felt adrift, a ship without a rudder, and the laughter from the kitchen was the siren song pulling me toward the rocks. For 3 weeks, I lived in a fog. I updated my resume, made calls, and sent out applications. The responses were polite but firm. Budgets were tight. Positions were frozen. I went on a few interviews where I sat across from people half my age who spoke in a language of synergies and paradigms that made me feel like a relic. Each rejection chipped away at my confidence. I started waking up at 3 a.m., my heart pounding, the numbers of our finances scrolling behind my eyelids like a macabre ticker tape. I saw the way Leo watched me during those weeks. He was quiet, observant. He saw me in my sweatpants, saw the phone calls that ended in sighs, saw the shadow of failure that had settled over me. He never apologized for the laugh. He never brought it up. He just watched, as if observing a science experiment. The turning point came on a Tuesday. The air was crisp with the first hint of autumn. I had been to another pointless interview and had stopped at the mailbox on my way home. Inside was a thick, cream-colored envelope from the bank. My stomach dropped. I knew what it was. It was the final notice for the HELOC payment, the one we had taken out to cover a leak in the roof and some of Sarah's medical bills a couple of years ago. It was a payment I had always managed to make, just barely, from my salary. It was also the one I had completely forgotten about in the panic of losing my job. I stood in the hallway, the envelope feeling like a block of ice in my hand. The total due was staggering. If I didn't pay it by the end of the week, the house we had all lived in, the home I had provided, would be in jeopardy. I walked into the kitchen where Sarah was unloading groceries. Leo was there, making a sandwich, his phone propped up against the salt shaker. I didn't say a word. I just placed the envelope on the counter between them. Sarah picked it up, her eyes scanning the page, and her face went pale. "Oh, Marcus," she whispered. "I didn't realize. I thought you had it." But Leo, he didn't look at the paper, he looked at me. And for the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than contempt in his eyes. It was confusion. He had seen me as a failure, a man who couldn't even hold down a job. He had laughed because he thought my world was small and easily broken. He didn't understand that the world I was holding up was his. I finally broke the silence, my voice sounding calmer than I felt. "This is the price," I said, looking directly at Leo. "This is the bill that comes due when the laughing stops." He opened his mouth to say something, probably a sarcastic retort, but I continued. "That tuition payment for your school? It's not automatic. That hockey gear you just got? It wasn't free. The roof over your head, the food in this fridge, it all has a price." I took a step closer, and he instinctively took a step back. "I have been paying it every single day for 6 years. And you thought it was funny when I told you I couldn't do that anymore." I saw the gears turning in his head. He was a smart kid, underneath the arrogance. He was doing the math. He was connecting the job he had mocked to the lifestyle he took for granted. The laughter from 3 weeks ago was starting to sound very different in his memory. It was no longer the sound of an enemy's defeat. It was the sound of a fool who had celebrated the destruction of his own shelter. The foundation of his world, which he had assumed was made of solid, unshakable rock, had just revealed itself to be made of my sweat and my effort. And he was starting to understand that I had just walked away from the quarry. "This isn't about a job, Leo," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "This is about respect. You thought my value was just a paycheck. You thought if that went away, I was worthless. But the money was never the point. The point was that I showed up every day for you, and you celebrated the day I stopped." I let that hang in the air. The silence was absolute. Sarah was looking between us, her eyes wide with a dawning horror at the chasm that had opened up in her kitchen. Leo's face was pale. The smugness was gone, replaced by a raw, naked uncertainty. He had learned who was really going to pay the price for his moment of cruel satisfaction, and the bill, I knew, had only just begun to come due. The silence that followed my words was a living thing, occupying the space between us, with a weight that pressed down on the air itself. Leo's sandwich lay forgotten on the counter, the mayonnaise slowly beading at the edges. He stared at the cream-coloured envelope as if it were a snake. His earlier bravado completely evaporated. He finally looked at me, his eyes wide and searching, and I saw the first real crack in the armour he had worn for years. It wasn't guilt, not yet. It was the dawning, terrifying comprehension of a child who has just realised the world is far larger and more fragile than he had ever imagined. He had been living in a house built by my hands and funded by my labour, and he had only ever noticed the architecture when he thought the foundations were crumbling. Sarah moved first, her hands fluttering like nervous birds. She reached for the envelope, then pulled back, as if touching it would make the debt more real. "Marcus, we can figure this out," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "I can pick up more shifts at the hospital. My mother could maybe." She trailed off, knowing her mother lived on a fixed income. The reality of the number on that page was a cold, hard fact that couldn't be wished away with overtime or small loans. It was the culmination of years of living just on the edge of our means, a life I had meticulously balanced on the head of a pin. Now the pin had bent. I held up a hand not to silence her, but to stop the frantic energy. "There's no more we to figure it out, Sarah," I said, my voice still unnervingly calm. "There is only the person who pays the bill and the people who benefit from it. I am no longer the person who can pay." I let my gaze settle back on Leo. "So, the question becomes, what happens now?" He flinched as if I had struck him. For his entire life, the answers had been provided, the problems solved by adults before he even knew they existed. The concept of consequences was an academic one, something that happened to other people in news stories. Now it was sitting at his kitchen table, demanding a response. He didn't have one. He swallowed hard, the motion of his throat visible from across the room. The phone in his pocket buzzed. A text from a friend, no doubt, asking about a game or a plan for the evening. The sound was jarringly normal, a relic from a world that no longer existed. Leo ignored it. For the first time since I had known him, his social life had ceased to be the center of his universe. The real world had finally intruded. I let the silence stretch, allowing him to feel the full weight of his new understanding. The laughter from 3 weeks ago was a ghost in the room, and he was finally seeing it for the haunting it was. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving the two of them to stare at the evidence of their collective failure. I went back to the garage, but not to work. I sat on an old wooden stool, the smell of sawdust a bitter comfort, and pulled out my phone. The severance package was a pittance, but it was the only liquid cash I had. I began the process of liquidating my life. I listed my professional tools on a marketplace app, the high-end drill I'd saved for months to buy, the precision miter saw that could cut a perfect angle in its sleep. Each listing felt like a small amputation. These weren't just objects, they were extensions of my skill, of my identity as a man who could build and fix things. I was selling the proof that I was competent, reliable, a provider. I was selling myself off in pieces. For the next 2 days, the house operated under a new, unspoken treaty. Sarah moved with a frantic, apologetic energy, cleaning things that were already clean, cooking elaborate meals that went mostly uneaten. She was trying to fix the unfixable with busy work. Leo was a ghost. He stayed in his room, the silence from his typically noisy space more deafening than the bass he usually played. I heard him moving around at odd hours, the floorboards creaking above my head in the dead of night. I imagined him staring at his ceiling, the reality of tuition and rent and the HELOC payment turning over and over in his mind. I felt no satisfaction in his distress, only a profound and hollow exhaustion. I had wanted to teach him a lesson in respect, not to shatter his entire sense of security. But perhaps they were the same thing. On the third morning, I woke before dawn, as usual, and found a mug of coffee waiting for me on the workbench. It was still hot. Leo was standing by the garage door, his arms crossed, wearing a hoodie. He looked like he hadn't slept. He didn't meet my eyes. He stared at the pegboard where my tools were now noticeably sparse, the empty spaces like missing teeth. He cleared his throat. "I looked up the tuition," he said, his voice raspy. "The school website. The payment portal." He paused, struggling. "It's a lot." I just nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. It was a small gesture, an acknowledgement of a fact he had previously ignored. It wasn't an apology. It was something more valuable. It was the beginning of awareness. "I sold the miter saw yesterday," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "A guy is coming for the drill set this afternoon. It'll cover maybe 2% of that envelope." I didn't say it to punish him, but to make the abstract concrete. Every object I had was now a number, a fraction of a debt. He flinched. "What are you going to do?" he asked, and for the first time the question wasn't a taunt, it was a plea. He was asking for a lifeline, from the man he had tried so hard to believe was worthless. I looked at him. This boy on the cusp of manhood, who had just learned that the world doesn't run on snark and sarcasm. It runs on money and effort and sacrifice. "I'm going to do what I've always done," I told him, placing the mug down. "I'm going to find a way to solve the problem. But the problem isn't just mine anymore." I saw him understand. The burden was shifting. He was beginning to feel its weight on his own shoulders. He was 17. He was capable. He had a part-time job on weekends stocking shelves at a grocery store. A job I had encouraged and he had treated as a joke, a source of beer money. He had never once considered it a contribution to the household. It was his. It had never occurred to him that his family was a system, and that every part had a function. He had been a consumer, never a contributor. He stood there for another moment, the silence stretching between us. The dynamic had irrevocably shifted. He was no longer the arrogant teenager, judging a failing adult. He was a young man, looking at the man who had been holding his world together, and he was seeing the cracks for the first time. He turned and left the garage without another word. Later that day, I heard him on the phone with his friend. His voice was low. "No, I can't this weekend." "Yeah, I know." "Are you a peer?" "No, I gotta work." A small thing, a tiny shift. But it was the first payment, not of money, but of a new understanding. The bill was coming due, and he was finally learning how to read it. The next week, the interviews continued, a parade of polite rejections. I was overqualified for entry-level jobs, underqualified for the few senior roles that existed, and too old for everyone in between. I was a ghost in the corporate world, a relic of a bygone era. The money from the tool sales was gone, absorbed into the mortgage payment that was due. The HELOC remained a monstrous, looming deadline. The tension in the house was a constant, low hum. Sarah was exhausted from her extra shifts, her face etched with new lines of worry. Leo was quiet, watchful. He started doing chores without being asked, taking out the trash, mowing the lawn. It wasn't a transformation, not yet. It was more like he was testing the waters of responsibility, dipping a toe in to see how it felt. One evening, I was in the garage, sorting through the last of my sellable possessions when Leo appeared again. He held out his phone. On the screen was his bank app, showing a balance of a few $100s. "It's not much," he said, his eyes fixed on the screen, "but it's something." I looked from the phone to his face. He was offering me his savings, the money he'd earned from stocking shelves and mowing lawns for neighbors. It was a significant amount for a 17-year-old. It was enough for a new gaming console, or a concert ticket, or 100 other things he valued more than anything I could provide. He was offering to sacrifice his own small world to help patch the larger one. I felt something shift inside me. For weeks, I had been running on anger and a sense of profound betrayal. The laughter had been a wound that festered, but this hesitant offer, was a balm. It wasn't an apology, but it was better. It was action. It was in finally understanding the fundamental equation of our life together. We were a unit, and when one part suffered, the whole suffered. "Keep it," I said, my voice softer than it had been in a month. "You're going to need it for when you go to college." He looked up, confused. "But the bill," he started. "The bill is my responsibility," I interrupted. "Your responsibility is to learn, to understand, to not be the person who laughs when the foundation shakes. You're learning. That's enough for now." I saw the relief wash over him, mixed with something else. Respect. He had offered me his money, and I had refused it, telling him his real value wasn't in his bank account, but in his character. I was treating him not as a source of funds, but as a person I was still trying to guide. The distance between us, which had felt like a canyon, suddenly seemed a little more bridgeable. He nodded, a short, sharp gesture, and slipped his phone back into his pocket. He lingered for a moment, watching me sort through an old toolbox. "What are you going to do?" he asked again, but this time it was different. This time it sounded like he was asking how he could help. I didn't have an answer for him. My grand plan had dissolved into a series of desperate small actions. I was a man with a set of skills that no one seemed to want, a mountain of debt, and a family that was finally, painfully, beginning to understand what it meant to be a family. I looked at the empty spaces on my pegboard, the ghosts of the tools I had sold. They represented a life that was gone. But looking at Leo, seeing the change in his eyes, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt since that day in the kitchen, a sense of purpose. The laughter had broken me, but maybe, just maybe, it was also the thing that would force us to rebuild something stronger. The house was still in jeopardy, my career was still in ashes, but the enemy was no longer just the bank or the job market. The enemy had been ignorance and arrogance, and for the first time I felt like we were finally on the same side. The bill was still due, but now we would face it together. The silence in the house changed again after that. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of unspoken resentments, but a quiet filled with a tense, fragile hope. The offer of money from Leo had been a bridge, but we still had to cross the chasm it spanned. The deadline for the HELOC payment loomed like a guillotine, a fixed point in a future that felt terrifyingly uncertain. My days took on a grim, monotonous rhythm. I would wake before dawn, the cold of the early morning seeping through the floorboards, and descend to the garage to continue the grim process of liquidation. The professional-grade socket set, the laser level, the high-torque impact driver, each one was a small death, a piece of the man I used to be handed over to a stranger in exchange for a few $100s that would be immediately consumed by the faceless entity known as the bank. The act of selling my tools was a public humiliation I inflicted on myself. Each Each transaction was a negotiation with men who saw my desperation and tried to drive the price down, their eyes flicking over the empty spaces on my pegboard with a predatory gleam. I swallowed my pride and took their lowball offers because pride didn't pay bills. I would come back into the house, the cash burning a hole in my pocket, and hand it to Sarah. She would take it with a look of profound sadness, adding it to the meager pile that was still so far from the goal. She had taken on extra shifts at the hospital, coming home late smelling of antiseptic and exhaustion, her smile a brittle, fragile thing. She was trying to outrun the debt, but it was a relentless pursuer. Leo, for his part, had become a model of silent cooperation. He was up before his alarm, his bed made with a precision he'd never shown before. He did the dishes, vacuumed the living room, and took out the trash without a single sarcastic comment or a sullen sigh. He was a ghost in his own home, moving through the spaces with a quiet deference that was almost more unsettling than his previous arrogance. It was as if he was trying to erase his former self, to become so unobtrusive that his presence wouldn't add to the burden. He still didn't speak to me unless I spoke to him first, and even then his answers were short, clipped, his eyes always darting away. The laughter was gone, but so was everything else. We were two strangers occupying the same house, bound by a shared crisis and a history of broken things. The first crack in this new fragile order came on a Friday afternoon. I had just finished a particularly degrading meeting with a man who had haggled me down to almost nothing for my table saw, a tool I had built custom furniture with for years. I came home and found Leo in the kitchen, his school backpack on the floor, his face pale and set. Sarah was standing opposite him, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of worry and frustration. The air was thick with the familiar tension of an argument that had just paused. "What's going on?" I asked, dropping my keys on the counter. Sarah sighed, a long, weary sound. "Leo's hockey coach called. The tournament in Calgary, the one he's been talking about all year. The deposit is due on Monday." She looked at me, her eyes pleading. "It's $500, Marcus." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. $500. It might as well have been $5 million. It was the amount I had just received for the saw, the amount that was already earmarked for the next installment of the property taxes. A tournament. A trip. A luxury. The word felt obscene in the context of our reality. Leo finally looked at me. There was no defiance in his eyes, only a stark, bleak resignation. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice flat. "I already told her I'm not going." He said it as a statement of fact, but I could hear the undercurrent of deep, gut-wrenching disappointment. This was the thing he cared about, the one passion that had driven him, the community where he felt competent and valued. It was the one thing he had never had to compromise on. "Leo," Sarah started, her voice soft, "we can try to figure something out." "How?" he snapped, turning on her the first flash of his old fire I'd seen in weeks. "With what? The magic money tree in the backyard? I see you, Mom. I see you coming home late, looking like you're going to collapse." "I see him," he said, gesturing vaguely in my direction without looking at me. "Selling everything he owns. There is nothing left to figure out." He was right. His new, grim awareness of our situation was a double-edged sword. It had made him responsible, but it was also crushing his spirit. He had learned a lesson I wanted to teach him, but the price of that lesson was his dream. I looked at him, this tall, lanky kid who had spent his life on skates, and I saw the utter defeat in his posture. He had accepted that his world was smaller now. He had accepted that he was a burden. And in that moment, something inside me rebelled. I had lost my job, my tools, my professional identity. I had been stripped down to the barest essentials, but I was still a father. And a father does not watch his son give up on the one thing that makes him feel alive. "Give me until Sunday night," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air. Both Sarah and Leo looked at me, surprised. "Marcus, what are you going to do?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with a desperate hope that I was terrified of extinguishing. "I don't know yet," I admitted, looking directly at Leo. "But I'm not going to let you give up on this. Not if it's what you truly want. Not for $500. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Disbelief, maybe, or the faintest glimmer of the old hope he used to have in me. He didn't say anything, but he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. The next 48 hours were a descent into a level of desperation I had never known. The severance money was gone. The tool sales were gone. I had nothing left to sell. The bank wasn't an option. Friends and family were out of the question. My pride wouldn't allow it, and they were not in a position to help anyway. I was left with only one asset, my own labor. But how to turn labor into $500 in 2 days? I scoured the online job boards, looking for anything. One-time gigs, day labor, cash-in-hand work. Most of it was for skilled tradesmen I no longer was, or for younger, stronger backs. I filled out applications for warehouse jobs, for delivery driving, for anything that promised a quick pay cycle. I sent out emails and made calls into the void, my resume a testament to a career that was now irrelevant. Saturday came and went. I spent the day driving to interviews for low-skill positions, each one a quiet humiliation. I was competing with 20-year-olds and men who had been out of work for months. The rejections were swift and impersonal. I came home late Saturday night, empty-handed and hollowed out. Sarah was asleep on the couch waiting for me. Leo's light was on under his door. I sat in the dark living room, the silence mocking me. I had promised him I'd seen the hope in his eyes, and I was failing to deliver. The laughter from the kitchen felt like it was coming from my own throat now. I couldn't sleep. At 3 a.m., I was back in the garage, staring at the empty pegboard, a monument to my failure. I was a project manager, a leader, a problem solver. What did a project manager do? He identified resources, he allocated tasks, he found a path forward. My resources were gone. My team was just me. What was the task? What was the path? I thought about the problem. Not the money, not the job, but the immediate specific problem of the $500. It was a project. The deadline was Monday. The objective was clear. My mind, for the first time in weeks, stopped spiraling and started working. I didn't need a job. I needed a solution. I thought about the people who had bought my tools. They were contractors, handymen, DIY enthusiasts. They had work. They had jobs they needed to complete. They didn't have time to go to the hardware store for a specific bolt or to run back to the office for a forgotten blueprint. They needed a runner, a gopher, a general assistant, someone to clear the site, fetch materials, hold the ladder. Someone reliable, someone who knew the difference between a Phillips and a flathead, who knew what a Craig jig was for. An idea, thin and fragile as a spider's web, began to form. It was a long shot, a desperate, humiliating long shot. But it was the only shot I had left. I pulled out my phone and opened the messaging app for the platform where I had sold my tools. I had the contact information for the men I had sold to. There were 3 of them. One had bought my drill set, another my sander, and some hand tools. The third my router. I started typing, my fingers clumsy with cold and adrenaline. I didn't write a play. I wrote a pitch, a professional, concise offer of services. Good morning, I wrote to the first man, a contractor named Dave. My name is Marcus. You bought my DeWalt drill set from me a few days ago. I'm a former senior project manager in a different industry, currently looking for short-term cash-in-hand labor. I'm reliable, I have my own vehicle, and I know my way around a job site. If you have any projects that need an extra set of hands for a day or two, or need someone to run for materials, I'm available immediately. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I'm looking to build a new reputation. I sent the same message to the other 2 men. It was a shot in the dark, fired from the depths of a desperate night. I didn't expect a reply. People like that didn't hire desperate strangers from the internet. I put the phone down on the workbench, the screen glowing in the darkness, and I waited. The sun began to rise, casting long grey shadows across the concrete floor. Another day, another failure. I went inside and started a pot of coffee. The movement's automatic. Leo came down the stairs, dressed for church, a rare occurrence these days. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. He saw the exhaustion on my face, the lack of an answer. He didn't ask. He just nodded and sat at the table, waiting for his coffee. The silence was back, heavier than ever. The project was a failure before it even began. Just as I was about to pour the coffee, my phone buzzed on the workbench. Then it buzzed again. Then a third time. My heart hammered against my ribs. I walked back to the garage, my hands trembling slightly. I picked up the phone. There were 3 replies. Dave, what kind of project management? Second man, a handyman named Frank. I've got a kitchen remodel starting Monday. Site is a mess. Need someone to demo and haul. 8 a.m. 150 for the day. Cash. Third man, a Finnish carpenter named Tom. I'm in a bind. Installing crown molding in a spec house. Can't get my usual guy. Need someone to hold, cut and fetch. Good with measurements. 200 for the day. Monday and Tuesday. I stared at the screen. 150 plus 200. 350. I needed 500. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. It was a chance. I typed back to Frank and Tom, my fingers flying. I'm good with measurements. I'll be there both days. Then I replied to Dave. Construction project management. I'm a fast learner, and I don't miss details. I walked back into the kitchen. Sarah and Leo were looking at me, having heard the frantic typing. I held up the phone. Monday and Tuesday, I said, my voice hoarse. 2 jobs. Demolition and finish carpentry. It's not the full amount, but it's $350. It's a start. Sarah's eyes filled with tears of relief. Leo just stared, his mouth slightly open. He had seen me fail for weeks. He had watched me shrink. Now, he was watching me find a way. Not as a senior project manager with a title and an office, but as a man willing to swing a hammer for cash. It wasn't the elegant solution he had always known. It was messy and undignified, but it was work, and it was a promise kept. The bill was still due, but I had just bought us a little more time. The smell of sawdust was different this time. It wasn't the familiar, comforting scent of my own projects in the garage, but the acrid dust of other people's homes being torn apart. Monday morning arrived with a cold grey dawn, and I stood on the driveway of a suburban house, my old work boots feeling alien on my feet. Frank, the handyman, was a grizzled man in his 60s, with a permanent squint and hands like worn leather. He handed me a sledgehammer and a pair of safety glasses. Demo simple, he grunted. Smash the old cabinets, load the debris into the dumpster. Don't hit any pipes. I'll be back in 2 hours. And then he was gone, leaving me alone in the gutted kitchen. The silence was immense, broken only by the hum of a refrigerator in the next room. For a moment, I just stood there, the sledgehammer heavy in my hands. I, Marcus, the man who had once managed multi-million-dollar construction projects from an air-conditioned office, was now a demolition laborer. The irony was a bitter pill. I thought of Leo, of the money I needed to earn for him. The thought was a spark that ignited a cold, determined fire inside me. I swung the sledgehammer. The first impact was shockingly loud, a splintering crack of particle board and formica. I swung again and again, putting the full force of my frustration, my anger, and my desperation into each blow. Sweat stung my eyes, my muscles screamed in protest, but with each shattered cabinet door, I felt a small piece of my own helplessness chip away. I was not a senior project manager. I was not a failure. I was a man doing hard, honest work, and for the first time in a month, I felt a flicker of pride. When Frank returned, he grunted in approval at the pile of debris. He handed me 2 crisp $50 bills. "You're strong," he said. "Come back tomorrow at 7. I need help framing a new wall." The money felt like a king's ransom in my palm. It was the first money I had earned in weeks that wasn't from selling off pieces of my past. It was new money, earned by the sweat of my brow. I drove home in a daze of exhaustion and elation, the $100 a tangible symbol of a turning tide. I walked into the house, covered in a fine layer of white dust, my muscles aching. Sarah was in the kitchen, and her face lit up with a hope so fragile it almost broke my heart. I didn't say a word. I just laid the 2 $50 bills on the counter. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, Marcus," she breathed. Leo was there, drying a plate. He saw the money. He saw the dust on my clothes, and the exhaustion etched on my face. He didn't laugh. He didn't smirk. He just stared at the bills, then at me. And for the first time, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. A quiet, profound respect. It wasn't for a title or a paycheck. It was for the man who had swung a sledgehammer all morning to keep a promise. The next 2 days were a blur of hard labor. I worked for the carpenter Tom, installing crown molding in a sterile empty spec house. It was meticulous, precise work, a world away from demolition. It required a steady hand, an eye for detail, and an understanding of angles and measurements. It was, I realized, a form of project management, just on a much smaller, more immediate scale. I held the long lengths of wood, made the precise cuts with a borrowed miter saw, and handed Tom the brad nails. We worked in a comfortable silence, punctuated by the rhythmic hiss of the nail gun. Tom was pleased. "You're a natural at this," he said on Tuesday evening, handing me $200. "I've got another job next week. A whole house of baseboards. You interested?" I looked at the money in my hand. $350 from Frank, $200 from Tom. $550. More than enough for the tournament deposit. I drove home that Tuesday night with a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of a job well done and a problem solved. When I walked in, Leo was sitting at the kitchen table, his homework spread out before him. He looked up as I entered. I walked over and laid the money on the table next to his textbook. It was a neat, thick stack of bills. He stared at it, then at my calloused, grease-stained hands. He slowly reached out and touched the money, as if to confirm it was real. "How?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I worked," I said simply. "I found people who needed work done, and I did it." He looked from the money to my face, his eyes tracing the lines of exhaustion and the new set to my jaw. The boy who had seen me as a failure was looking at a man who had clawed his way back, not with a phone call or a clever email, but with his own 2 hands. "The deposit is $500, he said. "There's more there." "I know," I replied. "The extra is for your flight and your hotel. Go pack your bags." I turned to walk away, my body aching for a hot shower and sleep. "Marcus," he said. I stopped, my back to him. I waited. The silence stretched. I could hear him struggling with the words, the same words he had refused to say for years. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I could feel the weight of the moment. "Thank you," he said. The words were quiet, but they landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just "thank you for the money." It was "thank you for showing up. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for being my father." I didn't say "you're welcome." I just nodded, a small gesture he could see in the reflection of the dark kitchen window, and walked away, leaving him with the evidence of what real effort looked like. The following Monday, the bank draft for the HELOC payment was due. I had the money from the tool sales, the money from the labor, and a final, desperate payment from Sarah, who had managed to borrow a small amount from a friend at work. We sat together at the kitchen table, the 3 of us, a strange and new configuration. I wrote the check, my hands steady. I was no longer the man who had to borrow from the future to pay for the present. I was the man who had found a way. I sealed the envelope and handed it to Sarah to mail. The crisis wasn't over. The mortgage still had to be paid. I still needed a real, sustainable job, but the guillotine had been stayed. The house was safe, for now. A week later, I was in the garage, cleaning my tools. The ones I had left. I had reorganized the pegboard, leaving space for the new. My phone buzzed. It was Tom the carpenter. "Hey Marcus," he said. "I was talking to a buddy of mine, a general contractor. He's got a big renovation project starting in a month. He's looking for a site foreman, someone who can read plans, manage a small crew, keep things on schedule. The pay is good. I gave him your name. He wants to meet you on Thursday. You interested?" I stood in the garage, the phone pressed to my ear. A foreman. A real job in the construction world. A step back perhaps from senior project manager, but a step forward into something new. A step built on the foundation of the last few weeks. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and strong. "I'm interested." That evening Leo came into the garage. He was packing his hockey bag for the tournament. He moved with a new efficiency, a new appreciation for the gear he was packing. He saw the empty spaces on the pegboard where I had sold my best tools. He saw the new cheaper hammer I had bought with some of the leftover money. He looked at me, then at the empty spaces. "You'll get them back," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of belief. I looked at him, this boy who had become a man in the space of a few weeks, not through age, but through understanding. The laughter that had once echoed in my head was gone, replaced by the memory of a quiet thank you. The foundation of our house had been shaken, but we had rebuilt it, not with my old salary, but with respect, shared burden, and the quiet, unglamorous work of people who refused to let their world fall apart. The story wasn't about the job I lost. It was about the man I had to become to find my way back. And as I watched my stepson pack for his future, a future